Hello, welcome to the Chemistry World Book Club. I'm Katrina Kramer. I'm Chemistry World's book club host. You might have heard me in the past, but maybe not seen. But I guess you might have guessed the reason. We're all working from home and have been doing so for a while due to the current situation. So we thought we record our this month book club as a lovely Zoom meeting. I'm here today with Jamie and Jen. Would you like to introduce yourself? Jamie, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jamie Durrani. I am one of Chemistry World's science correspondents, as is Kat. Looking forward to talking about this really interesting book.
Jen.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Newton, and I'm the RSC content editor at Chemistry World.
Fantastic. And the book we are talking about, this book club, is this one. It is Smoke and Mirrors, How Hype Obscures the Future and How to See Past It by Gemma Milne. Before we start discussing the book and our thoughts on hype and science, Jamie, you read the book. I mean, we all read the book, but you wrote the review as well. Could you give us like a little bit about what the book is about?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a really interesting book where Gemma Milne basically takes us through 9 different areas of science and technology that are at various stages of their development. And so it's quite a diverse array of topics. There's things like cancer treatment and things like quantum computing and artificial intelligence. And she gives us a bit of an overview of the kind of current landscape of each of those fields, where some of the most interesting advances are taking place. And then at the same time, she tries to give us a bigger picture and get us asking questions about what are maybe the sort of wider issues in these fields that we should all be concerned about. So she's kind of making the point that sometimes we'll all get really excited about a flashy headline about the latest advance, which might distract us from what are, maybe more important fundamental questions that we need to be asking, like who is regulating the field, or what are the challenges in the supply chain for this particular technology. Mm-hmm. I thought it was really thought-provoking read.
Interesting. Jen, you also read the book. What were your kind of first impressions while reading it?
Yeah, so I really enjoyed it. Like Jamie said, it's the kind of book that gets you thinking, and it made me want to be more mindful about the decisions that I make. And she's got some really interesting discussions on things like ethics and inertia and compromise when you're developing a technology. Saying that, it wasn't quite what I was expecting it to be.
What were you expecting?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe I expected it to be a bit more general, but because she does it on kind of a case study model, she has to go into a lot of detail on each things, and it was really well written. But some of them are a couple of them a bit heavy going. I don't think I really ever. I just accept that I'm not going to understand how a quantum computer works.
That's fair enough. So to find out more about the book, I called up Gemma on Zoom the other day.
I'm Gemma Milne. I'm a science and technology writer, and I'm the author of a book that's coming out next week. It's called Smoke and Mirrors, How Hype Obscures the Future and How to See Past It. And it's exactly as it says in the tin. It's all about how hype basically influences, distracts, obscures the future of science and technology, and why it's important we should all be thinking about it.
And why did you decide to write this book?
So I guess different jobs that I've had in the past have all had an element of hype in them. So I worked in advertising for a little while, which is obviously the creation of hype. I worked in investment banking, particularly in the team that does IPOs, who are obviously, going around the world trying to convince investors to invest in big companies. So that's a sales job, that's a hype job. And then I also worked in corporate innovation. So I spent a lot of time with startups and people who are kind of creating brand new science and technology and trying to tell everyone about how amazing it is. So obviously seeing that hype from the being sold to perspective. And now obviously as a journalist, I'm sure you see it all the time, you encounter people using hype as a tool to kind of get their narratives out. So originally it actually came from a sort of source of frustration. I wanted to be like, hype is this bad thing and we need to bust it and all this sort of anger and frustration. But over time I started to kind of see hype more as a tool, and I wanted to write about how we should sort of wield it more responsibly and spot it when it's doing problematic things, but see it in a slightly more generous way when it's being used for things that we really need it.
Mm. And how did you decide what to include specifically in this book?
It was kind of a combination of the areas of science and tech that, frankly, I just think are really interesting. But it was also thinking about the ones that I felt that hype was playing a role that was demonstrable, that I could kind of actually unpick and showcase a little bit, but also that I felt was just frankly really important right now. Particularly obviously chapters like food and cancer, which has huge impacts on our kind of our daily lives, everybody, not just the researchers, going through to areas that are slightly more, shall we say, industry specific, like quantum computing and batteries to some degree, but still these industries are having huge impacts on the world and will continue to have huge impacts on the world over the next sort of 5 to 10 years and beyond. So it was a sort of timeliness as well as personal interest and kind of knowledge of the fact that hype was already existing and playing a kind of intriguing role in those areas.
Who do you think will read this book, or who specifically did you write this book for?
It's interesting. Everyone says you should never write a book that's aimed at everyone, but my genuinely, I wanted to write something that was accessible. I didn't want it to feel dumbed down. So, hopefully you feel that it's readable but not too basic. I kind of see it as something that can influence people and hopefully have an impact on people in different ways. So, if you're just a citizen, shall we say, someone who's reading it going, I don't work in these areas, I'm like, well, actually, you can, and I argue should, play a role in part of the discussions and understanding what's going on in science and tech, whether that's from a voting perspective or a who do you retweet perspective or what do you support perspective, through to journalists who I think we need to have stronger conversations about responsibility in media, through to scientists themselves in terms of making sure you're not blinkered in your own kind of silo, which, as we all know, science can be very, very siloed, through to investors, policymakers. So I guess I kind of see it as, for people who think about the influence they have on the world, or they're interested in what's going on in the world and are not necessarily thinking about the influence they have on it, I hope that the book will be both interesting but also impactful. So yeah, to kind of go back and sort of undercut my first point, I think it is for everyone.
And do you have like one thing you want readers to take away from it?
I want readers to feel empowered. That was the point, actually. It's not to try and make people feel stupid or silly for getting caught up in hype, or even to try and make people feel, like, oh, wow, that's what's going on. Those people are wrong. That wasn't the point. The point was to showcase that you can come to having an understanding of complex topics, and you can have an opinion on complex topics if you don't have a PhD and you're not, a so-called expert or a perceived expert, and the second part of that is, and it's responsible that that it's important that you have a responsibility to take part. And again, it's not sort of pointing the finger and blaming, but trying to kind of say, come on, guys, the world is better if we all do this better, if we're all more responsible in what we say, and also how we kind of look at the narratives that are being, I don't want to say fed to us, but the narratives that we come across in our day-to-day lives.
And if you would write a second edition, what would you include?
Oh my goodness, that's a great question. Because I'm working on another book now and it's not a second edition, so I'm all caught up in that. The second edition of Smoke and Mirrors, I'm not sure. Probably there would be some stuff on coronavirus in it, frankly, because there's been a lot of really interesting kind of examples of a lack of hype in terms of getting important narratives out, as well as hype in areas that are problematic. I'm thinking about like the Oxford paper that everyone was going on about, the preprint. It's kind of opening up a sort of deeper question around how we talk about science and how science is done. As I'm sure you guys have been following at Chemistry World, like the idea of trying to make science more open and more accessible, both from a monetary perspective, but also in terms of, letting people understand it better and be able to access it. That's been great. We've been making great moves over the last sort of 5 to 10 years. And preprints is a big part of that. But the sort of downfall, shall we say, or the kind of worry that some people have around preprints is that they're taken as this final paper when they're not a final paper. They're put out there for discussion, which is a great thing in terms of doing science in the open and doing science better. But of course, what happens with the Oxford piece that I was talking about. The FT covered it. It got a whole load of, the message spread, and then a whole lot of people are saying scientists shouldn't be doing this research. It shouldn't be getting put out if it's not final. And it's a gross misunderstanding of A, preprints, and B, that a science paper is not final true knowledge, So I think there's been quite a lot of really interesting things that have been brought to the fore around science communication, specifically with regards to coronavirus, not to mention all that, how do we get people to do behavior change? How do we, communicate data? There's lots of really interesting narratives there. So maybe I would have a chapter on coronavirus. Actually, I probably would have to have a chapter on coronavirus if I was to do a second edition.
That was Gemma Milne talking about smoke and mirrors. So did any of you have any maybe favorite bits or things that were particularly thought-provoking, interesting?
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, one of the most interesting chapters was actually the one about batteries and battery technology. So this is obviously really important in, current day with...
Just got a Nobel Prize last year, so...
Yeah, exactly. And so, it's really important with the advent of renewable energy that we have a way to store energy and use it on demand. And we all carry little rechargeable batteries around in our phones, and we have them in our laptops and even in our cars, some people. So really important area. And she kind of highlights the really impossible balance between a number of different issues that are wrapped up in this technology. So she looks at the supply chain for batteries, and we all know that they use minerals, cobalt in particular, which is mined mostly in one area of Africa.
They call them, I think, problem minerals or something like that, or conflict minerals.
Conflict
I think.
Minerals,
Yeah,
exactly. And so we know there are issues with the way it's mined and the conditions of workers in those factories, and also the environmental impact of such large-scale mining. And she also looks at the kind of geopolitics involved in the supply chain of different components of batteries and things. And so she's basically making this point that we all want to have renewable energy and batteries to store that power because it has such a big impact on the environment. But at the same time, there are these human rights issues and politics at play, and there's the whole economics of the entire industry as well. And that, we, the consumer, want a cheap product, but how does that impact people further down the way? And I thought it was a really, really interesting discussion.
I think she keeps talking about something I've heard also researchers saying, like the holy grail of battery technology. And she's saying, is there such a thing really? Because there might always be like different technologies that work in different situations, and it's definitely something to consider. My favorite chapter was actually there were two. So I thought the very first one, which was on farming, was really fascinating because
that was my favorite one.
Yeah,
too.
What's your favorite? Jen, do you want to talk a little bit about that one?
I never imagined that government subsidies for farmers would be so fascinating. They're essentially encouraging poor soil management. And also in that one, she mentions about the carbon dioxide emissions from labs creating synthetic meat. And there have been studies that shown that the carbon dioxide emissions from there are more than you would get from regular meat farming. And I guess it just shows that things like life cycle analysis are so important. Even they can often seem a bit of a dry topic, but you need to really consider the whole thing. And also in the farming chapter, I really enjoyed the discussion about things like she says the system isn't broken, maybe it's just running on the wrong values, and that could apply to so many things. It could apply to, farming, but batteries as well. And she makes the point that society seems to just want to invent its way out of a problem, whereas really maybe we need to think about changing our values. And I thought that was just really thought-provoking, and I feel like we need to have more discussions like that in society.
So I thought in general that the book as you say, as you both say, it's very thought-provoking, and I think it makes an interesting point to the people like us who report on new developments in science and technology, because I felt it just made a point of how difficult it is to get things right. So there are chapters, for example, on quantum computing and artificial intelligence, were both things I've myself written about, and they are both very exciting, but I find they're also very difficult topics to explain. So in the chapter on quantum computing, she spends a long time explaining what a quantum computer is. And Jen, you said it is almost impossible for someone who is not in the field to really grasp what it actually is. I wondered, what did you feel this book, or like what she talks about in this book, meant for journalists like us?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think the kind of message that I really got from it is that it's for people like us who are writing about science, it's really about making sure that you're asking the right questions. And, something that we always do in Chemistry World is making sure that we have independent experts giving their thoughts and comments on, the latest study or technology that's come out, so that we can try and put that in some sort of context. And I guess that's something that it can be easy to lose sight of, and a lot of the time you'll see headlines that say that some new study is going to cure a disease or is going to cure all of society's problems by providing energy in this new amazing way. But it's about making sure that actually you don't get too carried away with the headline advance in this particular topic, but think more about, well, how does it fit into our world, and how how do the supply chains work? Where do the materials come from? Who are the people involved in making those?
Yeah.
So it's just something to kind of constantly be sort of digging that little bit deeper.
So I thought a lot of times, like as you said, we need to think about like how do we present something, including the caveats or like the early stage development, to make sure we're not overhyping things. But what I thought was really interesting, Gemma also includes a book on fusion, which I thought was a very interesting choice. It's kind of had this period of hype, I think it was like in the 50s, when people were first trying to do fusion to provide energy. And people got very excited about it, but then realized, well, it's not delivering on what people promised. And now it's almost kind of being bogged down, and people saying, regarding as kind of the pseudoscience. So I thought that was a very interesting choice. What did you think, Jen?
I hadn't previously really appreciated the whole fusion story before, and I think that kind of illustrates why it was a great example. I mean, we never have fusion papers that we discuss at Chemistry World? It really surprised me.
I thought that chapter was really interesting because it was one that sort of, this book is about hype, and it was one that illustrated hype in a slightly different way. Mm-hmm. So where other chapters you were maybe talking about, for example, cancer treatment, you might see a headline saying, oh, miracle cure for cancer, which is obviously overhyping something that it can never live up to. Whereas with fusion, she was talking about how the fact that it had been hyped in the past meant that since then there's been a bit of a lag for the sector because investment has slowed down, and as you say, people writing about it are maybe less likely to spend as much time talking about it, and so the investment from governments and from businesses kind of dried up a bit and actually slowed the development of an entire field. And I thought that was a really interesting point. And it was something that she did a really good job of explaining, because she herself has actually previously worked with like venture capital firms to try and identify sectors to invest in. And that was one thing that in this book she did really well, was explaining the whole technology transfer process and how companies and investment and government subsidies and government funds and things helped drive technology.
I guess it kind of showed you the life cycle of when something is hyped, because that started in the 50s, and will the same thing happen with AI or quantum computing? Will the same thing happen? It dries up, and even though it could be a good thing, it is never really kind of acted on because promises were made and not held up. So who do you think this book is for?
Yeah, so I spent a while trying to think who that should be for. I guess people working in policy, investors, but the writing is mostly general enough for anybody to pick up. But I think with a lot of these things, you're preaching to the converted, so the people that probably do really need to read it, they're not going to pick it up unless you can convince the Daily Mail to serialise it. But like we discussed before, science writers and science journalists, editors would do well to pick up this book too.
Absolutely, I agree. So if you'd like to know more about how to cut through the hype, Gemma Milne's Smoke and Mirrors is published by Robinson, and by the time you listen or look at this podcast, it should be out. It is also published as my favorite type of book, which is an audiobook. Next month we'll be reading this lovely book, which has a very lovely cover. I don't know if you can see it, it's very shiny. It is Anissa Ramirez, The Alchemy of Us, How Humans and Matter Transformed One Another. Until then, bye!